My grandson Jake whispered in my ear one Sunday afternoon, his voice barely carrying over the clatter of Carol setting the table. He said, "Grandma, they're taking everything. They're robbing you blind." I squeezed his shoulder and smiled like I hadn't heard a word. I kept folding napkins. I kept pretending the way you do when admitting the truth out loud would crack your whole life open. But that whisper changed everything. It changed what I saw when I looked at my son Nicholas sitting at the head of the table, thinner every week, quieter every month. It changed what I heard when Carol laughed too loud at her own jokes and called me sweetheart in that voice that made my spine go cold. And it changed what I knew about the storage unit across town, Unit 297, where boxes disappeared and documents vanished and my family's history was being erased, one piece of paper at a time. 3 questions burned in my chest that Sunday, and they burn still. Why would my son let his wife lock me out of the house I helped him buy? What was Carol hiding in that storage unit that she checked on twice a week like clockwork? And how far would I go to protect my grandson when telling the truth might cost me the only family I had left? If this story has already touched your heart, subscribe now, leave a like, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I'm 64 years old, and I raised Nicholas alone after his father died when he was 7. We built a life in Aspen together, the 2 of us against the world, and when he graduated from the state university and came home to help me run the family property management company, I thought I'd done something right. We managed vacation rentals, small condos mostly, nothing fancy, but it was steady work, and it paid for his college and kept the lights on in the little house on Sage Road where he grew up. I still remember the sound of his skateboard on the driveway every afternoon, the way he'd leave his backpack by the door and raid the fridge before homework. He was a good kid, quiet, thoughtful, maybe too trusting, but good. When he married Carol 5 years ago, I was relieved. He'd been alone too long after his divorce, and she seemed capable and organized, and she made him laugh. She worked as a medical office manager, and she had a daughter from a previous marriage, grown and gone, so she understood complicated families. At the wedding, she hugged me and called me Mom, and I felt my shoulders drop for the first time in years. Someone else would worry about Nicholas now. Someone else would make sure he ate and slept and didn't work himself into exhaustion. I noticed the changes slowly. A year into the marriage, Nicholas started losing weight. He said it was stress, a new medication, nothing serious. Carol took over his appointments, drove him to specialists in Denver, brought home pharmacy bags with labels I couldn't read. She was devoted, everyone said so. She'd show up at church on Sunday mornings with Nicholas on her arm, pale and leaning into her, and the ladies would whisper about what a blessing she was. I agreed. I thanked God someone loved my son that much. I didn't notice at first when he stopped answering my calls directly. Carol would text back for him, saying he was resting or in treatment or having a bad day. I didn't question when she suggested I visit less often because Nicholas needed quiet and routine. I backed off. I gave them space. I told myself this was what good mothers did. They let their adult children live their own lives. But Jake saw what I didn't want to see. Jake was 13 when his parents divorced and Nicholas got custody. The boy moved into the house on Sage Road with his father and Carol, and I saw him every Sunday for dinner, a tradition Nicholas insisted we keep no matter how sick he got. Jake was quiet like his dad, tall for his age, with dark eyes that noticed everything. He'd sit at the table and push food around his plate while Carol talked about her day, and Nicholas nodded, and I pretended everything was fine. One Sunday, Jake helped me carry dishes to the kitchen, and he whispered, "Does Dad seem weird to you?" I dried a plate and asked what he meant. He shrugged, skinny shoulders under an oversized hoodie. "Just weird, like he's confused all the time. And Carol keeps saying he can't remember things, but I remember him remembering them." I told him his dad was sick and medications did strange things to people, and it would get better. Jake looked at me like I'd disappointed him. He didn't bring it up again for months. The first real crack came in January 2 years ago. Nicholas called me himself, no Carol on the line, and he asked if I still had the deed to the house. I said of course. It was in my safe deposit box at the bank on Main Street, where it had always been. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said Carol told him I'd moved the deed, and he couldn't find the property tax records, and there was some kind of lien issue. I told him that was impossible. I paid the property taxes every year in October like clockwork. He sounded relieved and confused at the same time. He said he must have misunderstood. 2 days later, Carol called and said Nicholas had been confused again, mixing up properties, nothing to worry about. She laughed. She asked how I was doing and if I needed help with anything around my condo. I said I was fine. I hung up and sat at my kitchen table with my hands shaking, and I didn't know why. But the question Jake planted grew roots. Why would Carol lie about the deed? What lien was she talking about? And why did Nicholas sound scared on the phone, like he was checking something he thought might be true, but hoped wasn't? I pushed it down. I went back to work, back to checking on rental properties and dealing with tenant complaints and pretending my son wasn't disappearing in front of me. Then came the letter. It arrived on a Tuesday in March. Certified mail, return address from a law office in Denver I'd never heard of. The envelope sat on my kitchen counter for an hour before I opened it. Inside was a notice that Nicholas had filed paperwork to transfer ownership of the property management company to a new LLC. My name was being removed as co-owner. The transfer was set to be finalized April 15th. I had 30 days. The letter suggested I retain legal counsel. My coffee mug slipped from my hand and shattered on the tile floor. I didn't clean it up. I stood there in my kitchen in Aspen, Colorado, with broken ceramic at my feet and March light coming through the window. And I understood that my son was not in control anymore. I called Nicholas. Carol answered. She said he was sleeping and she'd have him call me back. I said I needed to speak to him now. It was urgent. It was about the company. Her voice changed, went smooth and careful. She said Nicholas had been meaning to talk to me about the reorganization. It was for tax purposes, she said. The accountant recommended it. My name would still be on everything that mattered. I asked what that meant. She said we'd all sit down together and go over the paperwork. It was just formalities, nothing to panic about. I asked when. She said soon. She said Nicholas was having a good week and they didn't want to stress him with business talk. I asked if my grandson was home. She said Jake was at a friend's house. I hung up. I sat in my car in the parking lot of the bank on Main Street and I called the law office on the letterhead. The receptionist said she couldn't discuss client matters. I asked if Nicholas had signed the paperwork himself or if someone signed on his behalf with power of attorney. She said she couldn't discuss client matters. I asked if I was still listed as a company officer. She said she couldn't discuss client matters. The line went dead. I stared at my phone and thought about Jake's question. Does Dad seem weird to you? That night I drove to the house on Sage Road. I didn't call first. I parked on the street and walked up the driveway and knocked. Carol opened the door in yoga pants and a sweatshirt, hair pulled back, barefoot. She looked surprised, then smiled that smile that never reached her eyes. She asked if everything was okay. I said I needed to talk to Nicholas. She said he was upstairs resting and really wasn't up for visitors. I said I wasn't a visitor. I was his mother. She kept smiling. She said of course she didn't mean it like that, but Nicholas had had a rough day and the doctor said he needed consistency and calm. I asked what doctor. She named someone I'd never heard of in Denver. I asked why he wasn't seeing Dr. Patterson, the family doctor who'd known Nicholas since he was a teenager. She said Dr. Patterson wasn't a specialist in Nicholas's condition. I asked what condition. She tilted her head like I was a child asking silly questions. She said we'd already discussed this, the autoimmune issues, the chronic fatigue, the cognitive symptoms. I said I wanted to see him. She said not tonight. I stood on the porch of the house where I'd raised my son, and Carol stood in the doorway blocking me, and I understood for the first time that I was not welcome in my own family anymore. I drove home shaking so hard I had to pull over twice. I sat in my condo and stared at the walls and tried to make sense of it. 30 days to lose the company I'd built from nothing. 30 days to become a stranger to my son. And somewhere in that house, Jake was growing up watching his father fade and his step-grandmother being erased, and he was 13 years old, carrying a secret too big for his bones. I didn't sleep that night. I made lists. I tried calling Nicholas 4 times. Carol answered every time and said he'd call back. He just needed rest. Please stop worrying. The 4th time she said, maybe I should talk to someone about my anxiety. She said it gently, kindly, like she was concerned. She said stress could do terrible things to women my age. I hung up and threw my phone across the room. The next morning, I called my lawyer, Tom Bradley, who'd helped me set up the LLC 20 years ago when I took over the property management business from the previous owner. Tom was 70, semi-retired, but he still kept an office downtown. He listened while I explained the letter, the transfer, the 30-day deadline. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said we needed to pull all the corporate documents and check the operating agreement and see what authority Nicholas actually had to make changes without my consent. He said if Nicholas had power of attorney from me, things got complicated. I said I never gave him power of attorney. Tom said good. He said we'd file an objection with the court and request a hearing. He said it would take time and it would cost money, and I needed to be prepared for Nicholas to be angry. I said Nicholas didn't even know what was happening. Tom asked what I meant. I tried to explain about Carol, about the confusion, about the phone calls and the blocked visits and Jake's question. Tom was quiet again. Then he said very carefully that what I was describing sounded like undue influence or possible elder abuse. I said Nicholas wasn't elderly. He was 42. Tom said the law applied to vulnerable adults, and if Nicholas was cognitively impaired and someone was controlling his assets, that was a problem. He said we needed evidence, documentation, witnesses, medical records if we could get them. I asked how. He said I'd have to start paying attention to everything. Every phone call, every blocked visit, every strange statement. Write it down, date it, keep copies of everything. I said I'd already lost 30 years of trust with my son. Tom said if I didn't act now, I'd lose everything else too. I started keeping a notebook, blue spiral-bound, college-ruled, the kind Jake used for school. I wrote down every call Carol intercepted, every excuse, every time Nicholas's voice sounded wrong on the rare occasions I got through to him. I wrote down the timeline of his illness, how it started vague and got worse after the wedding, how Carol became his medical spokesperson, and I became the worried old woman everyone smiled at and ignored. I wrote down the property transfer letter and Tom's advice and the name of the law office in Denver. I wrote down Jake's question from months ago. Does Dad seem weird? And underneath it I wrote my own question. What is Carol hiding? Jake gave me the answer on a Sunday in late March. We were in the kitchen again, just the two of us, while Carol and Nicholas sat in the living room. Nicholas had fallen asleep on the couch. Carol was on her phone, scrolling, her face lit blue in the dim room. Jake was loading the dishwasher, and I was wiping down counters, and neither of us was talking. Then he stopped and turned to me and said very quietly, I followed her. I froze with the dishcloth in my hand. I asked where. He said to the storage place on Highway 82, the big facility past the turnoff to Snowmass. He said Carol went there every Tuesday and Thursday like clockwork, stayed about 20 minutes, and always locked the unit behind her. He said he rode his bike there one afternoon after school and watched from behind the fence. I asked what unit. He said 297. I asked how he knew the number. He pulled out his phone and showed me a photo, zoomed in, grainy but clear enough. A beige metal door with a padlock and the number 297 stenciled in black. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. I asked why he followed her. Jake shrugged. He said he didn't know at first, just that something felt off. He said Carol acted different when she thought no one was watching. Careful, nervous. He said she always brought a tote bag when she went to the storage unit, and it was full going in and empty coming out. I asked if he'd seen what was in the bag. He shook his head. I asked if he'd told his dad. He looked at me like I was crazy. He said Dad didn't even remember breakfast most days. I asked if he was scared. Jake looked at his shoes. He said yes. He said he was scared Carol was doing something bad, and he was scared no one would believe him, and he was scared I was the only person who might listen. I pulled him into a hug, and he let me, this kid who was too old for hugs, and I felt his skinny shoulders shake. I told him he was brave. I told him we'd figure this out. I didn't tell him I had no idea how. That night I drove to the storage facility. It was after 10, dark, the highway empty except for the occasional semi hauling west toward the tunnel. The facility was lit with those harsh yellow security lights that make everything look flat and cold. I parked near the entrance and walked along the rows of units until I found 297. The padlock was industrial, expensive, the kind you couldn't just cut with bolt cutters from the hardware store. I stood there in the cold March wind and stared at that door and wondered what my daughter-in-law was hiding behind it. Medical records? Financial documents? Proof of whatever she was doing to my son? I pulled out my phone and took a photo of the unit number and the padlock. Then I walked back to my car and sat with the heater running and wrote in my notebook, March 23rd. Storage Unit 297. Carol visits Tuesdays and Thursdays. Jake followed her. Brings tote bag full, leaves empty. What is she moving? Tom Bradley filed the objection to the property transfer on March 28th. The hearing was set for April 20th, 6 weeks away, at the county courthouse. Tom said we had a good case for stopping the transfer, but we'd need Nicholas to testify or at least submit a statement. I asked how we'd manage that with Carol controlling his access to the outside world. Tom said that was the problem. Without Nicholas's cooperation or a medical evaluation proving he wasn't competent to make the decision, the court would likely allow the transfer to proceed. He said we could subpoena medical records, but it would take time and we'd need grounds. I asked what grounds. He said evidence of undue influence. I told him about the storage unit. He wrote it down. He said it wasn't enough. I asked what would be enough. He said I needed to get inside that unit, or get Nicholas to talk to me alone, or find someone who'd witnessed Carol doing something illegal. I said that was impossible. He said then I should prepare to lose. I stopped sleeping. I'd lie awake at night staring at my bedroom ceiling in the condo I'd bought after Nicholas moved out, and I'd run through scenarios, breaking into the storage unit and getting arrested, showing up at the house and demanding to see Nicholas and getting escorted off the property, calling Adult Protective Services and having them investigate and finding nothing because Carol was too smart to leave obvious tracks. I thought about Jake, 14 now, growing taller and quieter, carrying secrets that were poisoning him. I thought about Nicholas, 42, and disappearing, controlled and confused, and maybe dying for all I knew. And I thought about Carol, perfect Carol, devoted Carol, who smiled at church and brought casseroles to sick neighbors and was robbing us blind. The inversion happened at Easter. Carol hosted dinner at the house, invited half the church, set up tables in the backyard under string lights. I was invited too, of course. Carol made a point of including me, of asking me to bring my famous potato salad, of hugging me when I arrived and introducing me to guests as Nicholas's wonderful mother who'd raised him all alone. I smiled. I played the role. I stood in the backyard of the house where my son grew up and watched him sit in a chair near the fence, too weak to stand for long, and I watched Carol move through the crowd like a hostess, like the lady of the manor, like she owned everything. People complimented her. They asked about Nicholas's health, and she'd lower her voice and say he was fighting hard, but it was a difficult road. They'd nod and squeeze her hand and tell her she was so strong. No one asked me how I was doing. No one asked if I needed anything. I'd become invisible, the worried old mother, the difficult one who kept calling and texting and not understanding that Nicholas needed space. Jake found me in the kitchen washing dishes and he whispered, "She's going to the storage place tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. I heard her on the phone. I asked who she was talking to. He said he didn't know, but she said she had to move boxes before the 15th. April 15th, the deadline for the property transfer. I dried my hands and looked at my grandson, and I made a decision that probably saved my life. I said I was going to follow her. Jake said he wanted to come. I said absolutely not. He said it was his idea. I said it was my risk to take. He looked at me the way Nicholas used to look at me when he was a teenager, and I told him he couldn't do something, that mix of frustration and worry and love. He said fine, but I had to text him every half hour or he was calling the police. I agreed. That night, I couldn't eat. I sat in my condo with my notebook and I wrote down everything I knew. Carol controlled Nicholas's medical care, his finances, his contact with the outside world. She was moving boxes from a storage unit before the property transfer became final. Jake said she acted nervous, careful, like she was hiding something. Tom said we needed evidence of undue influence. I needed to see what was in Unit 297, but I couldn't break in. I couldn't prove she was doing anything illegal. All I could do was follow her and hope she made a mistake. I parked across from the storage facility at 8:30 the next morning. It was a Tuesday, clear and cold, the kind of April morning in Aspen that feels like winter hasn't finished yet. I had coffee in a travel mug and my phone charged and my notebook on the passenger seat. I felt ridiculous. A 64-year-old woman playing detective, spying on her daughter-in-law, staking out a storage unit like something from a bad TV movie. But I stayed. At 9:15, Carol's car pulled in, a white SUV that always looked freshly washed. She drove to the row where Unit 297 was located. I slouched down in my seat and watched. She got out with a tote bag, the same canvas bag Jake described, and she unlocked the unit and disappeared inside. I waited. Texted Jake. Here. She's inside. He texted back. Be careful. Carol was inside the unit for 25 minutes. When she came out, the tote bag was hanging empty from her shoulder. She locked the unit, got in her car, and drove off. I waited until she was gone. Then I got out and walked to Unit 297. The door was closed, padlock in place. I took photos of everything. The lock, the unit number, the timestamp on my phone. I walked around the building looking for security cameras. There was one at the entrance and one at the far end of the row, but nothing directly on Unit 297. I went back to my car and wrote in my notebook. April 5th, Carol at Unit 915-940. Removed contents from tote bag, unit still locked, no way to see inside. I drove home feeling defeated. I called Tom and told him what I'd seen. He asked if I got any photos of the contents. I said no, the unit was locked. He said then we had nothing. I asked what I was supposed to do. He said keep watching and hope she made a mistake. I asked how much time we had before the hearing. He said 2 weeks. I hung up and sat in my car in the parking lot of my condo complex, and I cried for the first time since this whole nightmare started. I cried for Nicholas, for Jake, for the family I thought we were. I cried because I was 64 and tired, and I didn't know how to fight someone who'd stolen my son and my business and my future and made it look like love. Jake called that night. He said his dad seemed worse, barely talking at dinner, forgetting Jake's name for a minute, staring at the wall. Carol said it was a bad day. The medication needed adjusting. Everything would be fine. Jake said it wasn't fine. He said he'd searched the house while Carol was at the grocery store, and he found pill bottles in the bathroom cabinet, lots of them, with labels that didn't make sense. Medications for anxiety, for sleep, for depression. Some with Nicholas's name and some without names at all. He said he took photos of the labels. He texted them to me. I opened the images and stared at my phone screen. Dozens of bottles, overlapping prescriptions, different doctors, different pharmacies, some from out of state. I called Tom. He said if Nicholas was being over-medicated, that was abuse. I asked how we proved it. He said we'd need a medical expert to review the medications and testify that the combination was dangerous. I asked how much that would cost. He said thousands. I didn't have thousands. The property business was barely breaking even, and most of my savings were tied up in the condo. Tom said we could try to get an emergency medical evaluation, but we'd need Nicholas to consent or a judge to order it, and judges didn't order evaluations lightly. I asked what happened if we did nothing. Tom was quiet. Then he said Carol would complete the property transfer, Nicholas would keep deteriorating, and I'd lose everything. That night, I made another decision. I called my sister in Boulder, Diane, who I hadn't spoken to in 2 years after an argument about politics that seems stupid now. I apologized. I told her what was happening. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she said she'd drive down the next morning. Diane arrived at noon on April 7th, with a box of files from her own messy divorce 10 years ago and a lawyer friend who owed her a favor. The lawyer's name was Rebecca Cho, 50s, sharp-eyed, no nonsense. She sat at my kitchen table and reviewed the photos of the pill bottles, the property transfer letter, my notebook with dates and times and blocked phone calls. She asked if Nicholas had given Carol power of attorney. I said I didn't think so. She said we needed to find out. She made phone calls while Diane and I sat on my couch not talking. An hour later, Rebecca came back and said there was a general power of attorney on file from 18 months ago, signed by Nicholas, notarized, giving Carol authority to make medical and financial decisions on his behalf if he was incapacitated. I asked if he was incapacitated. Rebecca said that was the question. The POA didn't specify what constituted incapacitation, which meant Carol could claim he was impaired any time she wanted. I asked if we could challenge it. Rebecca said yes, but we'd need evidence that Nicholas was coerced or wasn't competent when he signed. I asked how. She said we needed him to testify. I said that was impossible. She said then we had a problem. Diane stayed with me that week. We barely talked about the old argument. She made coffee and ordered takeout and sat with me in the evenings when the panic got too loud. On April 10th, I went back to the storage facility. Carol's routine was clockwork. Tuesday and Thursday mornings, 9 a.m., 20 to 30 minutes inside Unit 297. I photographed her car, the time, the locked door after she left. I felt like a crazy person. On Thursday, she brought 2 tote bags instead of 1. Both were empty when she left. I wrote it down. 2 bags. Removing more. Deadline is 5 days. The inversion happened on April 13th. I showed up at the house on Sage Road without calling. It was a Saturday afternoon, mild and sunny, the kind of day that made you think maybe spring was finally coming. I knocked and Carol opened the door in jeans and a sweatshirt, hair down, no makeup. She looked surprised and not happy. She asked what I was doing there. I said I wanted to see Nicholas. She said he was napping. I said I'd wait. She said it might be a while. I said that was fine. She stood in the doorway and I stood on the porch and we looked at each other. Then Jake came down the stairs behind her. He saw me and his face lit up and he said, "Grandma." Carol turned and her expression flickered, something cold and fast. She said Jake had homework. Jake said he'd finished it. Carol said he had chores. Jake said he'd done them. Carol said his father needed quiet. Jake said I could sit with him. Carol looked at me and I saw the calculation happening. If she kicked me out in front of Jake, he'd see it. He'd know. She forced a smile and stepped aside and said, "Of course, come in, but please keep your voice down." Nicholas was in the living room, not upstairs sleeping. He was sitting on the couch with a blanket over his lap, staring at the television on mute. He looked 10 years older than the last time I'd seen him up close, thin, pale, hollow-eyed. I sat down next to him and said his name. He blinked and turned his head slowly, like moving through water. He said, "Mom?" I said, "Yes, I'm here." He looked confused. He said he thought I was in Denver. I said, "No, I lived in Aspen. I'd always lived in Aspen." He nodded slowly, like he was trying to place the information. I asked how he was feeling. He said tired. I asked if he remembered the property transfer, the paperwork, the April 15th deadline. He stared at me. He said, "What deadline?" I said the company, our business, the LLC. He said he didn't know what I was talking about. Carol came into the room and said, "Maybe we shouldn't discuss business. Nicholas had been confused about work lately." Nicholas looked at her and said, "I signed something, didn't I?" Carol smiled and said, "Yes, honey. You signed the reorganization papers, remember? We talked about it with the accountant." Nicholas said he didn't remember. Carol said that was okay. It was all taken care of. I asked if I could see the papers. Carol said they were at the lawyer's office. I asked which lawyer. She said the one in Denver. I asked for the name. She said she didn't remember off the top of her head, but she'd send me the information. Nicholas looked between us like a child watching adults argue. He said his head hurt. Carol said he should go upstairs and rest. He stood slowly, the blanket sliding off, and he shuffled toward the stairs like an old man. Jake stood in the doorway watching, and his face was white. After Nicholas went upstairs, Carol turned to me with that smile that wasn't a smile. She said she appreciated my concern, but showing up unannounced was stressful for Nicholas. She said his doctors had been very clear that he needed routine and stability. I asked what doctors. She named 2 I'd never heard of. I asked for their contact information. She said she'd send it. I asked if Nicholas was taking all those medications I'd seen in Jake's photos. Her expression went flat. She asked what I was talking about. I said Jake photographed the pill bottles in the bathroom. Carol looked at Jake, and something cold passed over her face. She said Jake shouldn't be going through medicine cabinets. Jake said they were in plain sight. Carol said he was being dramatic. I said I counted 14 different medications, and I wanted to know if Nicholas's doctors knew he was taking all of them at once. Carol said I was overreacting and spreading paranoia, and if I didn't stop harassing her family, she'd have to consider a restraining order. The room went silent. Jake made a sound like he'd been hit. Carol kept smiling. She said she didn't want it to come to that, of course. We were family. But I had to understand that Nicholas's health was the priority, and my behavior was becoming disruptive. I asked if disruptive meant asking questions. She said disruptive meant refusing to accept that Nicholas was an adult who'd made legal decisions about his assets and his care. I asked if he'd made those decisions, or if she'd made them for him. Carol walked to the front door and opened it. She said I should leave. I asked if I could say goodbye to Jake. She said Jake had things to do. I looked at my grandson, and he looked back at me with those dark eyes, and I understood that this might be the last time I saw him for a long time. I walked to the door. I stopped and turned to Carol, and I said very quietly, "I know about Unit 297. Her face didn't change. She said she had no idea what I was talking about. She closed the door. I sat in my car and called Tom and Rebecca at the same time on a 3-way call. I told them about the conversation, about Nicholas not remembering the transfer, about the restraining order threat. Tom said if Carol filed for a restraining order and convinced a judge I was harassing her, I could be barred from seeing Nicholas and Jake. Rebecca said we needed to move now. She said we'd file for an emergency hearing, request a medical evaluation, subpoena the doctors Carol named, and the medical records and the pill bottles Jake photographed. She said it was a long shot, but we had 2 days before the property transfer became final. Tom said we'd need Jake to testify about what he'd seen in the house. I said Jake was 14 years old. Rebecca said 14-year-olds could testify. I said I didn't want to put him through that. She said we might not have a choice. I drove home, and I sat in my condo, and I called Jake's cell. He answered on the first ring, whispering. He said Carol was in the garage, and he only had a minute. I asked if he was okay. He said no. He said Carol had taken his phone after I left, but he snuck it back. He said she'd told his dad I was sick, losing my memory, making up stories. He said his dad believed her. I asked if Carol said anything about the storage unit. Jake said no, but she'd left right after I drove off and didn't come back for 2 hours. I asked if he could check what she was doing. He said he'd try. I told him to be careful. He said he wasn't scared of her anymore. I said maybe he should be. The line went quiet. Then he said, "Grandma, what if she's really hurting him?" I said we were going to stop her. He asked how. I said I didn't know yet, but I was working on it. He said the hearing was in 5 days and April 15th was in 2. I said I knew. He said he wanted to help. I told him the best thing he could do was stay safe and keep his head down and not give Carol any reason to cut off his phone or lock him out of the house. He said okay. He said he loved me. I said I loved him too. The line went dead. Rebecca filed the emergency motion on Monday, April 14th. The hearing was scheduled for Wednesday, April 16th, 1 day after the property transfer deadline. Tom said it was the best we could do. Rebecca said we needed Nicholas in court or the judge would rule against us. I said Nicholas couldn't stand for more than 10 minutes. Rebecca said we'd get a medical transport if we had to. I asked how. She said she was working on it. Monday night I couldn't sleep. I stared at my notebook, pages and pages of dates and conversations and blocked phone calls and pill bottles and storage unit visits, all of it circumstantial, all of it suspicious, but not proof. I thought about Carol sitting in a courtroom lying under oath with that perfect smile. I thought about a judge deciding I was a paranoid old woman. I thought about Nicholas dying in that house, confused and controlled, and Jake watching it happen. Tuesday morning, I went back to the storage facility one last time. I don't know what I thought I'd find. Carol's car was there. Same routine, 9 a.m. on the dot. I parked across the street and watched. She went inside Unit 297 with both tote bags. She was inside for 40 minutes, longer than usual. When she came out, the bags were empty, and she looked flustered, stressed. She stood outside the unit for a minute checking her phone, then she locked the door and left. I waited until she was gone. Then I got out of my car and walked to Unit 297 and I tried the door. Still locked. I looked around. No one. Just rows of beige metal doors and yellow lights and the sound of traffic on Highway 82. I pulled out my phone and I called the storage facility office. A bored-sounding woman answered. I said I was Carol Marshall and I'd forgotten my key to Unit 297 and could someone help me. She said she couldn't give out keys, but if I came to the office with ID, she could let me in. I said I'd be right there. I hung up. I stood there in the cold April wind and I thought about what I was about to do. Breaking and entering, fraud, possibly theft if I took anything. I could go to jail. I could lose any chance of stopping Carol legally. But I was 64 years old and out of time, and my son was disappearing and the hearing was tomorrow, and I had nothing. I walked to the office. The woman at the desk was young, maybe 25, staring at her phone. I said I was Carol Marshall, and I needed to get into Unit 297. She asked for ID. I said I'd left it in my car, but I could describe the unit and the lock, and I had my phone with photos. She looked bored. She said she couldn't let me in without ID. I said, please, I was moving things out before my husband's medical procedure tomorrow, and I was under so much stress I couldn't think straight. She looked at me. I must have looked desperate because she sighed and said fine, but I couldn't tell her manager. She grabbed a key ring and walked with me to Unit 297. She unlocked the padlock and said I had 10 minutes. I thanked her. She walked away, scrolling her phone. I opened the door. Inside was a 10 by 10 space with a bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. No windows. Cold. the smell of cardboard and dust. Stacked against the walls were boxes, dozens of them, labeled in Carol's neat handwriting. Financial records, medical bills, legal, property docs, tax files. I pulled out my phone and started taking photos. I opened the first box labeled Financial Records. Inside were bank statements, withdrawal slips, transfer receipts, Nicholas's accounts. Money moving out in regular increments, 5,000 here, 3,000 there, 10,000 to an account I didn't recognize. I photographed everything. I opened the legal box. Property transfer documents, unsigned copies with Nicholas's signature lines, highlighted. A real estate appraisal for the house on Sage Road. A contract for a reverse mortgage. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold the phone. I opened the medical bills box. Invoices from pharmacies, receipts for medications, doctor's bills from clinics I'd never heard of. And underneath, prescription pads. Blank prescription pads with doctors' names printed at the top. But no security features, no watermarks. I stared at them. Carol was writing her own prescriptions. I heard footsteps outside. I froze. The storage facility woman called out, "You almost done?" I said yes, just finishing up. My heart was hammering. I shoved the prescription pads into my purse. I photographed the rest of the medical bills box as fast as I could. Then the property docs box, deeds, titles, transfer forms. Everything Nicholas owned, everything we'd built together, ready to be signed over. The footsteps got closer. I closed the boxes, stacked them back the way they were, turned off the light, and stepped outside. The woman was standing there looking impatient. I said, "Thank you so much. I got what I needed." She locked the unit and walked back to the office. I got in my car and I drove 5 blocks and I pulled over and I threw up in a grocery store parking lot. I called Rebecca. I told her everything. I sent her the photos. She was quiet while she looked at them. Then she said, "This is evidence of fraud, financial abuse, and possibly practicing medicine without a license." I asked if it was enough. She said it was enough to get the judge's attention. She said we needed to get those boxes into evidence before Carol moved them. I asked how. She said she'd file for an emergency seizure order. She said we also needed Nicholas at the hearing tomorrow, and he needed to be clear enough to answer questions. I said Carol wouldn't let him leave the house. Rebecca said then we'd have to go get him. That night, Diane and Rebecca and I sat in my kitchen and planned. Rebecca said she could get a court order for a medical evaluation, which would give us legal grounds to transport Nicholas to a hospital. She said it would take until morning. Diane said we couldn't wait until morning because Carol might move the boxes tonight if she suspected anything. I said Jake could watch the house and text if Carol left. Rebecca said we couldn't involve a 14-year-old in a legal operation. I said Jake was already involved. Rebecca looked at me for a long moment. Then she said fine, but if anything went wrong, she'd never forgive me. I called Jake. He answered on the second ring. I told him to watch for Carol leaving the house tonight and to text me immediately if she did. He asked why. I said I'd explain tomorrow. He said, okay. At 11 p.m., Jake texted. Carol just left in the SUV, heading toward Highway 82. I called Rebecca. She said if Carol was going to the storage unit at night, she was moving evidence. She said we needed police there now. I said the police wouldn't believe us. Rebecca said they would if we showed them the photos and the prescription pads. Diane said we should go ourselves. I said that was insane. Diane said it was the only option. Rebecca said if we went and Carol caught us, we'd all be arrested. I said if we didn't go, Carol would destroy everything and Nicholas would die and we'd never prove a thing. Rebecca closed her eyes. Then she said she'd meet us there. She said she was bringing a witness. We drove to the storage facility in 2 cars. Mine and Rebecca's. Rebecca brought another lawyer from her firm, a man named David who looked terrified. We parked near Unit 297 and waited. At midnight, Carol's SUV pulled in. We watched from the shadows. She got out with a stack of collapsed boxes and went into the unit. The light came on inside. Rebecca said we had 5 minutes before we lost everything. She walked to the unit. Diane and I followed. David stayed in the car looking like he wanted to disappear. Carol was inside stacking boxes when Rebecca knocked on the open door and said, "Carol Marshall?" Carol spun around. Her face went white. Rebecca introduced herself as Nicholas's legal counsel and said we had photos documenting the contents of this unit and we'd filed for an emergency seizure order. Carol said we were trespassing. Rebecca said actually, I'd been given permission to enter earlier in the day by the facility staff. Carol looked at me, and her expression was pure rage. She said I'd committed fraud. Rebecca said Carol had committed fraud, financial abuse, and medicinal malpractice. Carol said she had no idea what we were talking about. Rebecca pulled out her phone and showed Carol the photos of the prescription pads. Carol said those weren't hers. Rebecca said the handwriting on the labels matched the handwriting on the boxes. Carol said we were making wild accusations. Rebecca said we'd see what a judge thought tomorrow. Carol walked toward the door. Rebecca stepped aside. Carol stopped and looked at me, and she said very quietly, "You'll never see your grandson again." I said if she kept Nicholas locked up and medicated into oblivion, she'd be arrested. Carol laughed. She said I was delusional. She said Nicholas chose her, chose this life, and I needed to accept that I wasn't needed anymore. She walked to her car and drove off. Rebecca called the police. I sat on the curb in the parking lot of the storage facility, and I shook. Diane sat next to me and put her arm around my shoulders and didn't say anything. An hour later, 2 sheriff's deputies arrived. Rebecca showed them the photos and the prescription pads I'd taken. They looked at each other. One of them asked if we'd filed charges. Rebecca said we were filing for an emergency hearing in the morning. They said they'd secure the unit and take the evidence into custody. They asked if Nicholas was in danger. I said yes. They asked where he was. I gave them the address on Sage Road. At 2 in the morning, the deputies went to the house. Carol answered. They asked to speak to Nicholas. Carol said he was sleeping and couldn't be disturbed. They said they had a wellness check order. Carol said they couldn't come in without a warrant. They said they could enter if they believed someone inside was in imminent danger. Carol let them in. They found Nicholas upstairs in bed, unconscious or asleep. They couldn't tell. They called an ambulance. Nicholas was transported to Aspen Valley Hospital. Carol followed in her car. I followed with Diane and Rebecca. We sat in the emergency room waiting area at 3 in the morning while doctors evaluated my son. A nurse came out and asked if I was family. I said I was his mother. She asked if I knew what medications he was taking. I said I had photos. I showed her Jake's pictures of the pill bottles. Her face went pale. She said she'd be right back. An hour later, a doctor came out. He said Nicholas was severely overmedicated. He said the combination of sedatives, anti-anxiety medications, and sleep aids in his system was dangerous and explained the confusion, memory loss, and physical weakness. He said they were running tox screens, and Nicholas would be admitted for observation and detox. I asked if he would recover. The doctor said probably, if the medications hadn't caused permanent organ damage. I asked if they'd found evidence of coercion. He said he couldn't discuss that without Nicholas's consent. I asked if I could see him. He said Nicholas was sedated now, but I could see him in the morning. Carol was sitting across the waiting room. She was on her phone. She didn't look at me. At 6 a.m., I called Jake. He answered immediately. I told him his dad was in the hospital and he was going to be okay. Jake started crying. I told him the hearing was today at 2 p.m., and we needed him to testify about what he'd seen. He said yes. He said Carol had come home at 4 a.m. and locked herself in her room. I told him to stay away from her. He said he would. The hearing was in a small courtroom at the Pitkin County Courthouse. Tom, Rebecca, and I sat at one table. Carol and her lawyer sat at another. Nicholas was not there. He was still at the hospital. The judge was a woman in her 60s, gray hair, sharp eyes. She listened while Rebecca presented the evidence. The photos of the storage unit, the financial records, the prescription pads, the pill bottles, the medical report from the hospital showing dangerous medication levels, Jake's testimony about what he'd observed in the house, the blocked phone calls, the controlled access, the systematic isolation. Carol's lawyer argued that Nicholas had made independent decisions about his care and his finances, and I was a bitter ex-mother-in-law trying to control an adult man's life. Rebecca asked if independent decisions included forging prescriptions and systematically draining Nicholas's accounts. Carol's lawyer said there was no proof Carol had written the prescriptions. Rebecca said the handwriting analysis would prove it. The judge asked for the prescription pads. They were submitted as evidence. The judge looked at them for a long time. Then she looked at Carol and asked if she had a medical license. Carol said no. The judge asked if she'd written prescriptions for Nicholas. Carol said she was following doctor's orders. The judge asked which doctor. Carol couldn't name one. The judge asked for Nicholas's medical records from the doctors Carol claimed were treating him. Carol's lawyer said they'd need time to gather those records. The judge said they had 24 hours. She suspended the property transfer. She ordered Nicholas's accounts frozen. She ordered a medical evaluation to determine if Nicholas had been competent when he signed the power of attorney. She scheduled a follow-up hearing for May 1st. She looked at me and said, "Mrs. Peterson, you're free to visit your son. If anyone prevents that, call the court immediately." Carol sat stone-faced while the judge spoke. When it was over, she walked out without looking at anyone. I went to the hospital. Nicholas was awake, groggy, hooked up to IVs. He looked at me and said, "Mom?" I said yes. He said he didn't understand what was happening. I sat on the edge of his bed and I held his hand and I told him everything. I told him about Carol, the medications, the storage unit, the money, the property transfer. He cried. He said he didn't remember signing anything. He said he remembered Carol being kind at first, helpful, taking care of things, and then everything got foggy. He said he thought he was losing his mind. I said he wasn't losing his mind. He was being poisoned. He asked about Jake. I said Jake was the one who saved him. Nicholas closed his eyes, and more tears leaked out. He said he was sorry. I said he had nothing to be sorry for. He asked what happened now. I said we'd figure it out. Nicholas stayed in the hospital for 5 days. The detox was hard. Withdrawal from that many medications made him sick, shaky, confused. The doctors said it would take weeks for his system to clear and months before they'd know if there was permanent damage. Jake came every day after school. He'd sit by his dad's bed and do homework or just be there. Nicholas apologized to him over and over. Jake said it wasn't his fault. On the 3rd day, Nicholas asked where Carol was. I said she'd gone back to her daughter's place in Denver. He asked if she was coming back. I said I didn't know. He looked relieved. The follow-up hearing was May 1st. Nicholas testified in a wheelchair, still weak but clear-eyed for the first time in 2 years. He told the judge he didn't remember signing the power of attorney. He said Carol had brought papers to him when he was confused and medicated and told him they were routine medical forms. He said he'd trusted her. The judge asked if he wanted to revoke the power of attorney. He said yes. The handwriting analysis came back. The prescription pads matched Carol's handwriting from the storage unit boxes. Carol's lawyer tried to argue the analysis was inconclusive. Rebecca presented testimony from 2 pharmacists who said the prescriptions had been filled at their locations, with Carol presenting them as Nicholas's caregiver. One pharmacist said Carol had been filling overlapping prescriptions for sedatives and sleeping pills for 18 months, and she'd raised concerns internally, but nothing had been done. The judge asked where Carol was. Her lawyer said she'd declined to appear. The judge issued a warrant. She revoked the power of attorney. She ordered full restitution of all funds transferred from Nicholas's accounts. She referred the case to the district attorney for criminal investigation. She looked at Nicholas and said, "Mr. Marshall, you're very lucky your mother didn't give up on you." Nicholas looked at me across the courtroom and nodded. Carol was arrested on May 4th at her daughter's house in Denver. She was charged with financial exploitation of an at-risk adult, fraud, identity theft, and practicing medicine without a license. Her bail was set at $50,000. She posted it. The criminal trial was set for September. Rebecca said we'd likely be called as witnesses. I said I'd testify. Jake said he would too. Nicholas said he wanted to face her in court, but he wasn't sure he could. I told him he'd have time to get stronger. The district attorney assigned to the case was a woman named Patricia Vance, early 40s, methodical and relentless. She interviewed me, Nicholas, Jake, the pharmacists, the storage facility employee, the hospital staff. She subpoenaed Carol's financial records and found accounts I hadn't known about. Carol had opened credit cards in Nicholas's name, taken out a home equity line of credit on the Sage Road house, applied for loans using his information. Over 2 years, she'd moved nearly $200,000 out of his accounts and into accounts she controlled. Some of the money was still there. Most was gone. Patricia said Carol had probably been planning to complete the property transfer, sell everything, and disappear. I asked what would happen to Carol if she was convicted. Patricia said she was looking at 10 to 15 years. I didn't feel triumph. I felt tired. Nicholas moved into my condo when he was released from the hospital. He couldn't go back to the house on Sage Road. Not yet. Too many memories. Too much shame. Jake stayed with us on weekends and most weeknights. The house felt crowded and warm and right. Nicholas gained weight slowly. His memory came back in pieces. Some things were clear. Some were gone forever. He didn't remember signing the property transfer papers. He didn't remember whole months from the previous year. He remembered Jake whispering to him sometimes that things weren't right, and he remembered not being able to hold on to the thoughts long enough to do anything about them. He said the fog was the worst part, knowing something was wrong, but not being able to see it. I told him it wasn't his fault. He said he should have known. I said Carol was good at what she did, and he'd been vulnerable, and she'd exploited that. He said he'd let her cut me out of his life. I said we were fixing it now. Jake turned 15 that summer. He grew 3 inches, and his voice dropped, and he started looking more like his father every day. He didn't talk much about what happened, but sometimes at night I'd hear him on the phone with friends, and he'd say things like, "Yeah, my grandma basically saved my dad's life," and I'd sit in my kitchen with tea and cry quietly. One night, Jake came out and found me, and he said, "You okay, Grandma?" I said yes, just tired. He sat down across from me and he said, "I knew you'd believe me." I asked how he knew. He said because I'd always listened to him, even when he was little, even when what he said didn't make sense to adults. He said his mom used to tell him he worried too much and his dad was too out of it to notice, but I'd always taken him seriously. I told him he saved us. He said we saved each other. The property management company was a mess. Carol hadn't been running it, just draining it. Tenants had complaints going back months. Properties needed repairs. The books were chaos. Nicholas and I spent the summer rebuilding. It was slow work. Nicholas tired easily, and his focus came and went, but he was determined. He said he needed to prove to himself he could still do something useful. By August, we had the business back on track. We hired a part-time bookkeeper, a retired accountant named Marianne, who didn't ask questions about why everything was such a disaster. We caught up on repairs. We apologized to tenants. We rebuilt our reputation. It wasn't the same as before, but it was something. The trial started the second week of September. The courthouse was the same building where the hearing had been in May, but this time the room was bigger and there were more people. Carol sat at the defense table in a navy suit, hair pulled back, calm and composed. She didn't look at us. The trial lasted 6 days. Patricia Vance presented the evidence methodically. The storage unit contents, the prescription pads, the financial records, the medical testimony about Nicholas's dangerous medication levels. The pharmacists testified about filling overlapping prescriptions. Jake testified about what he'd seen in the house, the pill bottles, his father's confusion, the way Carol controlled access and information. He was calm and clear, and the jury watched him with serious faces. Nicholas testified about the fog, the lost time, the way Carol had told him I was sick and couldn't be trusted, and he'd believed her because he couldn't hold on to his own thoughts long enough to question hers. I testified about the blocked phone calls, the storage unit surveillance, the moment Jake whispered that they were robbing us blind, and I pretended not to hear because admitting it meant facing something too terrible to name. Carol's lawyer argued that Nicholas had been a willing participant in financial decisions, that the medications were prescribed by legitimate doctors even if Carol had filled them, that I was a controlling mother who couldn't accept my son's independence. He painted Carol as a devoted wife, overwhelmed by a sick husband and a hostile mother-in-law. He said the storage unit was just Carol trying to organize paperwork. He said the money transfers were legitimate expenses. He couldn't explain the forged prescriptions. The jury deliberated for 9 hours. They came back with guilty verdicts on all counts. Carol's face didn't change. The judge set sentencing for November. In October, Nicholas and I went back to the house on Sage Road together. He hadn't been inside since the arrest. We walked through slowly. The furniture was the same. The kitchen where Jake had whispered to me. The living room where Nicholas had sat, confused and medicated while Carol controlled everything. The upstairs bedroom where he'd been found unconscious. He stood in the doorway and said, "I don't think I can live here again." I asked what he wanted to do. He said, "Maybe sell it, start over somewhere, without ghosts." I said that was his choice. He asked if I thought that was running away. I said, I thought it was survival. We listed the house in November. It sold in January to a young couple from Texas with 2 kids. Nicholas used the money to pay back what Carol hadn't already spent, and to put a down payment on a small house near mine, 3 bedrooms, a yard for Jake, windows that let in light. Carol was sentenced on November 20th to 12 years in prison. The judge said she'd systematically exploited a vulnerable man, stolen his autonomy and his assets, endangered his life, and traumatized his child. Carol was led out in handcuffs. I watched her go and I didn't feel vindicated. I felt sad for all of us, for Nicholas who'd trusted the wrong person, for Jake who'd had to grow up too fast, for the years we'd lost. Nicholas sat next to me, and when it was over, he said, "Thank you." I said, "For what?" He said, "For not giving up." Jake whispered to me at Christmas dinner that year, 2 years after the first whisper that started everything. We were at Nicholas's new house, small and warm, lights on the tree, food on the table. Just the three of us. Jake leaned over while Nicholas was carving the turkey and he said, "This feels like home again." I said it did. He said he was proud of me. I asked for what? He said for being brave enough to see the truth even when it hurt. I told him he was the brave one. He shrugged in that teenage way and said, "Maybe we both were." Nicholas recovered slowly. Some of the cognitive effects from the prolonged medication were permanent. He had trouble with memory sometimes, with focus, with processing complex information quickly. But he was himself again. He laughed. He made decisions. He called me just to talk. He and Jake had long conversations about everything and nothing. He dated occasionally, cautiously, and I didn't ask questions. He said he wasn't sure he'd ever trust someone that way again, and I said he had time to figure it out. The property business stabilized. We were never going to be rich, but we were steady. We had clients who trusted us. We had a reputation we'd rebuilt brick by brick. Jake graduated high school in the spring when he turned 17. He gave a speech at graduation about resilience and family and speaking up when something's wrong even when you're scared. I sat in the audience with Nicholas and Diane, and I cried. After the ceremony, Jake came over and hugged me and said, "None of this happens if you don't listen to me that day." I said none of it happens if he doesn't have the courage to whisper. He said he'd been terrified I wouldn't believe him. I said I'd been terrified he was right. He laughed. He said we made a good team. That summer, Jake worked part-time at the property management office, learning the business, talking about maybe studying real estate or business management in college. He talked about staying local, going to the community college for 2 years, then transferring. Nicholas said he didn't have to stay close just for us. Jake said he wasn't. He liked Aspen. He liked the work. He wanted to build something. I watched him at the office, tall and confident, fielding calls from tenants and contractors, and I saw the man he was becoming, strong and careful and kind. I thought about the scared 14-year-old who'd followed his stepmother to a storage unit and taken photos because something felt wrong. I thought about the whisper that saved us all. Nicholas and I had coffee one morning in August on the deck of his house. The mountains were green and close, and the air smelled like pine. He said he'd been thinking about Carol, about how he'd missed all the signs. I said the signs were designed to be missed. He said he kept wondering what would have happened if Jake hadn't noticed, if I hadn't acted, if we'd just let it happen. I said we didn't let it happen. He said barely. He asked if I ever regretted it, going to the storage unit, risking everything. I said no. I said I regretted not acting sooner. He was quiet. Then he said, "I remember the day Jake whispered to you. I remember seeing it from the couch. I remember thinking something's happening and I can't figure out what." I asked why he didn't say anything. He said he couldn't hold the thought. It was like trying to catch smoke. He said Carol had told him later that week that you'd seemed confused at dinner and he should watch out for signs I was declining. He said he'd believed her because he couldn't trust his own memory anymore. I reached across the table and took his hand. I said we were okay now. He said we were okay because I hadn't given up. The document I'd tucked away, the one I never mentioned to anyone, was a letter Carol had written to Nicholas early in their marriage. I'd found it in one of the storage unit boxes, mixed in with the financial records. It was dated 3 months after the wedding. In it, Carol laid out her plans in careful detail, how she'd isolate Nicholas from his mother and his support system, how she'd use medication to keep him compliant, how she'd transfer assets slowly so no one would notice until it was too late, how she'd use Jake as leverage if I tried to intervene. She'd written it like a business plan, cold and methodical. I'd shown it to Patricia Vance during the trial. It had been part of the evidence that convicted her, but I'd kept a copy, and sometimes late at night I'd take it out and read it and remind myself that evil wasn't always loud. Sometimes it smiled and brought casseroles and called you sweetheart while it destroyed you. Jake asked me once if I hated Carol. We were driving back from a property inspection, just the two of us, late afternoon sun coming through the windshield. I said I didn't hate her. He asked how that was possible after everything she did. I said, hate took energy I didn't want to give her. I said I was angry. I was sad. I was relieved she couldn't hurt us anymore, but hate felt like letting her win. He thought about that. Then he said, "I think I hate her a little." I said that was okay too. He said she tried to take his dad away and make him think it was normal. I said he'd been right to trust his instincts. He said he almost didn't. He said he'd told himself for months that he was being paranoid, that Carol was nice and his dad was just sick, and he was imagining things. I asked what changed. He said the storage unit. He said watching her sneak off twice a week to somewhere she thought no one knew about, that's when he knew for sure something was wrong. I asked why he told me instead of someone else. He said because I was the only one who'd ever treated him like what he noticed mattered. The family we became was different from the one we'd been. Smaller, careful, marked by what we'd survived. Nicholas and Jake were close in a way they hadn't been before, the kind of closeness that comes from walking through fire together. Jake called me most days, just checking in. Nicholas and I ran the business as partners, equal and transparent, every decision documented and discussed. We had Sunday dinners at his house or mine, rotating. We didn't talk about Carol much. She existed in a prison 4 hours away, and sometimes I'd get notifications about parole hearings years in the future, and I'd mark my calendar to oppose them. But mostly, she was gone from our daily lives. What she left behind was a family that knew how to fight for each other. I'm 66 now. Jake is 17, about to start college. Nicholas is 44 and healthy, truly healthy, for the first time in years. The property management business is steady and small, and ours. I live in my condo with plants on the balcony and photos of Jake at graduation on the fridge. Some mornings I wake up and think about that Sunday afternoon when Jake whispered in my ear and I pretended not to hear. I think about how close we came to losing everything, how silence almost killed us. I think about the storage unit and the prescription pads and the judge's face when she suspended the property transfer. I think about Nicholas in the hospital hooked up to IVs, crying and apologizing. I think about Jake at 14 taking photos of pill bottles because something felt wrong. The lesson I carry, the one I'd tell anyone who'd listen, is this. When someone you love whispers that something's wrong, you listen, even when it's terrifying. Even when admitting the truth means your whole world breaks open. You listen, because silence protects the wrong people. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop pretending you didn't hear. If this story has touched your heart, subscribe now, leave a like, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. That helps us keep sharing stories of strong women, families, and the unexpected turns of life.